Ranchview Wolf, by the way. And so please join me in giving her a big Wolf Ranchview welcome to Miss Regan Byrd.
So a long time ago, it looks exactly the same. So the pond area and all the colors. It's great to visit again and see my old middle school. High school I went to Mount Vista, which apparently is not popular because y'all are going to go to Thunder Ridge. So when I said that last time, students were like, "Oh, I don't like Mount Vista," which is fine. I enjoy my old high school, and I like Thunder Ridge too. So, just real quick about me. So I am an anti-oppression speaker, trainer, activist, and consultant. I do this part-time right now, and I've presented to Douglas County administrators. I've presented to Denver Public Schools, to lots of different organizations and nonprofits. And what I'm really trying to do is have us all as a community have a collective conversation about what oppression is and what it really means to create better rules, better ways of doing things, thinking about the lived experiences of all of your fellow students, of what type of environment we're trying to create. So that's what this conversation is about today. But you're going to get a training that is a training that lots of adults in this district and lots of parent groups and other folks have gotten as well. And it's so that we all can have a similar language about these problems and about what our solutions are. So I just want to let you know that this is a conversation that I want you to enter into as yourselves, as students, to say, these are my schools, this is my community, these are my environments. I want to say and how some things happen. I want to say and what my experiences have been. So hopefully this training today will give you some shared language and some common understanding about what this whole issue is about, and also will empower you to have your own conversations and to think about what type of school environment you would like to create. So let's dive right into it. So I'm going to talk to you about a model for understanding oppression, and it's called the 4 I's of oppression. And when I say oppression, what I mean by that is when people use the term racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, when they're using those words, what they're talking about is oppression. They're talking about how a marginalized group, people who are on the margins of society, people who are considered outside the mainstream by that society, how they're treated, what their experiences are, how they are getting discriminated against. So that's what I mean by oppression. I'm talking about all of those things at once. We're going to focus a little bit on racism today because that is a big and major area of oppression that we're trying to work on, not only in this community, but in the whole of the United States. So just so you know that when I say oppression, that's what I mean. But this model that we're going to go over is for you all to have a deeper understanding of what oppression is and how oppression operates. So, to start that, we're going to watch this video. It's a very quick video, it's about 45 seconds. And you're going to see it on a loop it's going to play 3 times, and because the video as a whole is only about 15 seconds. I want you to pay attention to a couple of things in the video before I play it. I want you to pay attention to, first of all, there's a school resource officer in it. I want you to pay attention to his actions. I want you to pay attention to the actions of the student that he's interacting with. And then I want you to pay attention to the reactions of the students around him as he's intervening on a student. So we're going to watch that video. It's going to play once fast, once in slow motion, and then fast one more time. And then we're going to dismiss it. So this is a incident that happened in 2015 with a school resource officer in South Carolina. Oh, hold on. hear that at the end he's telling her to put her hands behind her back because he is arresting her. And let's keep conversation to a minimum for now. And you're gonna see it one more time. She was either 12 or 13 at the time, and not doing questions yet, but we can do. May have time for a question or two at the end. I'm going to explain what that video is about. So if you're confused about well, what even prompted that or anything, then I'm going to explain that right now. So that school resource officer was called in by a teacher because that student that you saw, she was texting on a cell phone. The teacher asked her to put it away, and she refused to put it away. Then the teacher thought that that was severe enough that she needed to call a school resource officer to come in and intervene on the student. The police officer, or the resource officer, he's also a police officer, he said, I tried to talk to the student, this is his assessment of it, and she also refused to leave the classroom to talk to me, so that was his reaction. He said, well, she's being resistant, so I'm going to arrest her. And then you see the video about what the arrest was. I don't see in the video that she's resisting. I see in the video that she is not leaving her seat, but you can see her getting flipped over and all of that sort of stuff in the video. So that's concerning to me. And I imagine it was concerning to many of you. Imagine if that was happening to you in your classroom or happening to a fellow student. What would you do? What is behind an incident like that? Is that how we want our school resource officers to behave, or do we want them to do something different? So we're going to use that incident to discuss oppression and how we need to think differently about how a lot of our institutions work. This isn't against school resource officers per se, in terms of whether they're a good resource to have in schools or not. This isn't about being against police officers. This isn't being against law enforcement. What this is to say, are we doing a good enough job being anti-racist, being anti-sexist? Are we teaching officers how to do that well? Are we teaching them the skills that they need not to react to situations like that? So that's kind of what I want to talk about. How good are these institutions at challenging some of these problems? How are they thinking about their own self and what they need to learn? So, in that incident, a couple of things I want you to know. That was School Resource Officer Ben Fields. He was summoned to a classroom by school staffers on October 26, 2015 to remove a student who was refusing to put her cell phone away. Fields told the television station when he asked the girl to leave the classroom with him, he asked her to do so they could talk. And when she declined, he moved in to arrest her. And the video is of the arrest. The county sheriff's office fired him 2 days later because he was concerned about the video he saw. And he asked the FBI and the Department of Justice to investigate whether any civil rights had been violated. The severity of what that incident was and how aggressive he was with the student, there was concerns that the student's civil rights as a black female student had been violated. The Justice Department, however, said that there wasn't enough evidence to charge Fields with any criminal civil rights violations. In September, the Fifth Circuit solicitor announced that no charges would be filed against Fields, or he said the disruptive student or the student who encouraged her classmates to video the incident. And when I say that, I say, so there was a discussion about whether the student herself was going to get arrested. There was a conversation about whether the students who filmed this happening in their classroom were going to get arrested. So what does that mean? Are we okay with a law where if you're concerned as a student about something happening in your classroom and you're trying to film it to let people know what's happening, but you might be arrested because of that? Well, is that a rule that we want? Do we think that's fair? Do you think that represents your interest as a student? Those are some of the questions I want you to ask yourself. And then finally, Fields, on January 10th, so the officer filed a defamation and negligence lawsuit against the sheriff's department because he accused them of depriving him of his rights. So him getting investigated for him treating the student that way, he said, oh, you investigating me is violating my rights. And he claimed that he was getting treated differently because of his race, saying that he was getting discriminated against because he's white, and that he suffered a severe reputational loss as a result of that. So my other concern with the school resource officer If I saw a video of myself behaving that way, and it shocked the community, and people were concerned, well, look at how rough you were with the student, look at how violent that appears. But once you get told that, your response is, oh, I think I'm getting discriminated against. I think this is really a problem you have with me. Not willing to reflect on his own behavior, not willing to question what he did. I'm concerned about how that school resource officer, how he got trained, how he got hired, what his perspective is on what his role is towards you as students. What could have been done differently in this incident to have prevented this from happening? We're going to talk about that going through this model of the 4 I's. So the first way oppression operates, and again, oppression is racism, sexism, homophobia, etc. The way oppression operates is on 4 levels, and the first level is ideological oppression. And what I mean by ideological is it's a system of its beliefs, ideas, notions, concepts that you have about broad social structures and systems in the US. So I want you to think about, close your eyes if you would like, and I'm going to name some words and I want you to think about the types of behaviors that come to mind, the types of relationships that come to mind. When I say words like friendship, what are friendly behaviors? What are unfriendly behaviors? When I say things like romance, what are romantic behaviors? What types of things do you expect someone? If somebody says, I have romantic feelings for you, what would you expect them to feel, to think, to say? Think about your concepts of family. Think about your concepts of humor, what you find funny or not funny. Behind all of those are ideologies, beliefs that we have, beliefs that shape our expectations of things. So I am doing this presentation in a skirt and a jacket. If I had shown up in a bathrobe and kind of my hair in curlers and fuzzy slippers and just started to do the presentation normally, a lot of you might have said, well, that looks odd. I'm not sure why she's dressed like that to do a presentation. And the reason that would have looked odd to you is because I would have violated your expectation about professionalism, about an assembly, and what types of people are up here giving assemblies to you. It wouldn't have looked odd if maybe you knocked on my door at 6 o'clock in the morning and I answered the door like that, because then you had expectations that I was at home and maybe my personal dress. So, again, think about when something looks odd to you, when somebody behaves in a way you don't expect. Below that, underneath that, is an ideology. It's an understanding of what those behaviors are, what normalcy is. What you think of being normal or not normal in certain situations has ideologies behind it. So when we talk about oppression, we're typically talking about ideologies we have about groups of people in this country. You may also understand that as a stereotype. So all stereotypes are a kind of ideology, but not all ideologies are stereotypes. So there are 2 different things, and sometimes we're talking about one or the other, but right now going forward, we're going to talk about ideologies we have about people, or stereotypes. So we have an ideology, or a negative ideology, or a negative stereotype about Black people in this country. We have a stereotype that they are more violent, more criminal. We have a stereotype that they are more aggressive and resistant to authority. So that stereotype causes bias in people. It causes people to expect certain behaviors from Black people, especially if you are not a Black person yourself. That underlying stereotype can inform how people are reacting to you as a Black person. So we can look at that video and we can think about, why did the officer have such a strong reaction to a student, yes, who was being defiant, who was not putting away her cell phone, not listening to the teacher, and was refusing to get out of her chair, but was just sitting in her chair and simply not obeying a command, essentially. What could have informed the officer's reaction to that student? Well, we can look at ideology. We can look at stereotype and say, is this a part of why the officer reacted to this specific student this way? Because we know this happens often to students of color. We know that this happens to Black and brown students in terms of how they are reacted to differently than students who are not Black or brown. So we can examine the officer's behavior and say, how did stereotype inform form bias or his perception of the student's behavior and why he reacted so severely. Last point I want to think about ideology is that we have roughly, as humans, two different types of memory. We have episodic memory and we have semantic memory. So what I mean by episodic versus semantic memory is, if I was to ask you, okay, tell me what the game of baseball is. Tell me how you generally play it. Most people can answer that question. There's 4 bases, and there's a pitcher, and there's a catcher, and there's batters who hit the ball, etc., etc. That's not a great explanation of baseball, but it's sufficient. If I was to ask you how to play baseball, what is baseball, that would be your semantic memory. It's kind of your fact-based memory. It's your general information that you have. Whereas this other type of memory you have, episodic, is don't tell me about what baseball is. Tell me what exactly happened during the 7th World Series game and the last time the World Series was played. Tell me about what the specific plays were during that game. That would be your ability to recount the when and the where and the how of something. It would be your ability to recount dates and the sequence of events that happened, during that game. So your semantic memory is kind of your fact-based general knowledge, whereas your episodic memory is your ability to recount when and where things happened. And that memory is much weaker than our semantic memory. Our episodic memory is a weaker form of memory than our general memory. And the reason why that shows up in oppression is because a lot of people, when you're doing this work, will think they're talking from a place of fact, but will actually be talking from a place of ideology or stereotype, but they're not aware that that's where they're talking from. They will think that, no, I'm sure that I learned this somewhere. I'm certain that I read this, or wasn't there a study that showed this? And a lot of times, no, there isn't. People are kind of meshing together multiple different things in their mind. But because they cannot recount when and where they learned their information, because they cannot recount where did I read this? When did I learn it? Did I read it in a news article? Did I read it in a textbook? Did I have a conversation with a parent or a coworker? Because they can't recall when and where they learned something because of that weaker episodic memory, they have a hard time auditing their own memory. They have a hard time saying, oh, this thing that I thought was a fact actually isn't. I got that information from an unreliable source. So ideological oppression is really insidious because our own memories are unreliable sometimes. So we have to go back and challenge ourselves. Is that really true? Do I really know that for sure? Let me go back and look that up. Let me go online and Google that to make sure that I understand this concept correctly, or that I understand what the statistics are. We have to do that in this work, and I couldn't do that in this work very often because not being able to do that can lead to us believing stereotypes that are not true. Next level oppression operates on is institutional. And this is the level that is really, really important that I want you to walk away with. So if you take nothing else from this training, I want you to remember this part that I'm talking about. And that is that institutional oppression is the level where hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives get affected, because this is where we create rules and policies and procedures. This is where those ideologies that we have, those stereotypes, get made into rules, laws, policies, and procedures. So, in the past, the Federal Housing Administration still exists today, but in the past, it had a formal policy. It was in their underwriting manual called redlining. And what redlining was the Federal Housing Administration, again, this was a formal policy that was written in their book. They said, we don't believe incompatible racial groups should be able to live together. So we're going to separate white communities from black communities, and we're going to draw red lines around all the traditionally black and brown communities, and we're going to prevent them from getting loans. We're not going to give them loans. We're not going to give them mortgages. We're not going to give them home improvement loans. And in fact, some neighborhoods that had already been integrated, this was around the 1930s, some neighborhoods neighborhoods that had already been integrated, they actually resegregated those neighborhoods on purpose. And they did that through their policies and their rules. One of the rules, for instance, was saying, we're going to build public housing for workers, but we're going to say only black workers can live here or only white workers can live here. There can be no interracial housing. So that's one way that they resegregated neighborhoods, by making sure that folks could not live in integrated housing. So that was a formal Federal Housing Administration policy. So that rule, based on a stereotype, based on an erroneous understanding of different racial groups, based on negative stereotypes, they created rules that then affected the economic, political, and social capital that entire groups got in the United States. So redlining happened in every single major metropolitan city in the United States. Yes, it happened in Denver, and I will show you that map later. It happened in Baltimore, it happened in California, in multiple cities in California, it happened all across the United States. So that's what I mean by institutional oppression. What happens when folks start creating rules that deny entire groups resources? How do we challenge that? How do we examine that and see what the effects of that are? We can also talk about other macro level institutions, macro being they have a high level of influence. So think of federal policy, think of what the federal government is doing, think of even here, we might think of our state government as being a macro level institution. They have the ability to influence everyone living in Colorado. We can talk about law enforcement. We can talk about the Vatican. So the Vatican has international rulemaking responsibility. When the Vatican decides something, every single kind of Catholic church and entity across the entire globe has to follow those rules, has to change what their rules are. We can talk about the Department of Education. Their rules affect you, affect how we're able to structure our schools, affect what funding you're able to get. And we can talk about the media. The media is a primary way that ideology is spread. So when I gave you that example of dating and romantic behavior earlier, most of you probably, I don't know if are y'all starting to go on dates? I'm kind of out of sync. Yes, no, thumbs up. Yeah, good for you. So when I said dating and romantic behavior, what came to mind for a lot of you? Likely you didn't ask your parents, well, what am I supposed to be doing on this date? Or tell me what is a romantic thing to do? Most of you probably didn't Google it. Most of you probably have an idea what that type of behavior is from the television shows you watch, from the movies you watch. You've seen what folks your age do on dates or what that type of thing is, and you learned it from the culture through the media you consume. So media is one of the primary ways we also get ideology spread through our culture. And finally, we can also talk about micro-level institutions. So we can talk about Denver Public Schools versus Douglas County Public Schools. We can talk about Aurora Police Department versus the Arapahoe County Sheriff's Office. And why can we do that? Because each of them have their own rulemaking capability. They have their own policies and procedures that affect people based on what those rules and policies are. So, in the video we watched, let's think about how that incident might have come about due to the rules or policies that were happening. So one of them I talked about a little bit earlier. Well, how did the officer get trained? How did he get taught about anti-racism or anti-oppression and how that might affect his work? What is the policy for calling the school resource officer on a student? If a student is misbehaving, is the policy to call a school resource officer on them? Or maybe the policy should be to call a counselor, to call the principal. Maybe it should be to have a conversation with the student after class. Maybe the policy shouldn't be that if a student is being disrupted that we automatically call a school resource officer or that the student be arrested. So that's something that we should think about. How are folks getting trained, and what are the rules that teachers, administrators, school resources officers should follow? One last point I'd like to make about this is your home is a micro-level institution. How many folks have a curfew rule at your home? Like where you have to be home by a certain time? Oh, not very many. I had one, I think it was, so there's a citywide curfew for if you're underage. I don't remember what the age limit is. But a lot of us maybe have rules that we have to follow in our own homes. So your parents, and those rules that are created in your home, that's a micro-level institution. So there are rules that you have to follow. The question is, if you think some rules in your own home are unfair, or if you have things to question about that, maybe that's a part of what this work is too. You being able to think about what's fair and unfair, what makes sense, what is the reasoning behind certain rules. We can think about that on the smallest level. We can think about that in our own homes, and we can think about that on the highest possible level. We can think about global policy too. So the way we think about things can translate, this type of thinking can translate to the smallest level in our homes or the largest level in terms of institutions, our state policy, our federal policy, all of that. Another thing that's an emerging area of study is dress code policy, and how dress code policy affects, especially specifically female students in a lot of our public institutions. So there's a report out by the National Women's Law Center that talks about dress code policy and how that has been unfairly implemented on some students versus others. So this report talks about how black female students will have harsher penalties or be looked at differently in terms of dress code policy than other folks. One example is sometimes there will be rules against certain hairstyles. And some of those hairstyles will say, okay, you're not allowed to wear braids. You're not allowed to wear cornrows. You're not allowed to wear twists. You're not allowed to wear this. And they'll say, well, that rule is neutral. No student can wear those hairstyles. The problem is, all of those hairstyles I just named are traditional black hairstyles for a lot of black female students. So, is that rule really fair? Does that rule really make sense? Or does it actually have a racial bias behind it in terms of how it's getting implemented and who it's affecting? So this is something that we also talk about in terms of what's affecting our student body and how are rules being implemented on you all? And is it really fair? Is it based off of an understanding of these principles? Next level is interpersonal. And this is the level most people understand oppression to operate on. So this is when I use the word racism. And somebody says, well, isn't that just about negative individuals or bad individuals? Isn't that just about people with poor character in their heart? People who have hatred towards other people. And yeah, there's individuals who have hatred, but once we get rid of all of those, or those individuals get educated out of that, then we're kind of done, right? Doesn't racism end if there's no racist individuals left? And that is a level oppression operates on. It still took that individual resource officer to conduct that arrest the way he did. Still took that individual teacher to make that decision to call the resource officer. So individual decisions are still a part of this, and how individuals feel are still a part of this. But the problem is that's not the only level oppression operates on. Thinking about it just being interpersonal ignores the institutional level, ignores the ideological level. We have to look at the very idea that people are different, the very idea that one group is inferior to another group. That idea starts all of this. And then when we have rules, when we have policies that negatively impact whole groups of people, that is the most important and most impactful level of oppression. So interpersonal is still a level, but it's not the only level. So when we're talking about racism, remember that racism is also a system. That is also about how these institutions are operating. It's not just about an individual who maybe has racist attitudes or beliefs. It's about that system too, and it's about those ideologies too. Last level oppression operates on is this kind of least well-known and least talked about level. And this is the one we're going to talk more about when we go into the pod activities. Because we're going to do an activity called Theater of the Oppressed, and it's a way to demonstrate physically what some of these principles are. And we're going to be talking about implicit bias in that training. But this level is called Internalized, and that says, how do all of these other three levels, these ideologies, if I'm a black student, these negative ideologies about me, and these institutional interactions, and these interpersonal interactions, how do all of those affect my beliefs about myself? How do those affect how maybe I regulate my own behavior, or how I choose to behave? So, first is our beliefs about ourselves. If you've heard of, in the 70s, there was a whole phrase in the 1970s called Black is Beautiful. And what that phrase was trying to do was it was trying to combat the negative feelings that that a lot of Black children had about themselves, feeling like they were less desirable, less worthy than other people. And that came from a lot of sociological studies and from what the Black community themselves felt and understood about their community. So, I'm not sure if y'all have learned about Brown versus Board of Education yet. It was a Supreme Court case that ended school segregation. One of the pieces of evidence they used in that Supreme Court case was something called the doll test. And what they did was they would have a dark-skinned doll and a light-skinned doll, and they would show it to children of different races. And they would say, point to the doll who's the smartest. Point out the doll who's the prettiest. And all races of children would continue to point to the light-skinned doll. So those beliefs about yourself, if you are a Black or brown person, and you're saying, I don't believe that I am smart, I don't believe that I am pretty, because of what these stereotypes or ideologies are, that then affects how you feel about your own self, and that is a type of internalized oppression, when you believe those kind of stereotypes about your own self. So today we have, so in the 70s we had the Black is Beautiful phrase to try to challenge that, and today a modern equivalent of that would be the Black Girl Magic hashtag. It's trying to accomplish the same thing, to get folks to think differently about themselves, to not believe negative ideologies and stereotypes. Another way is how we regulate our own behavior, how we respond to what these stereotypes are against us. So there is a well-studied phenomenon that does show up in how we educate children and how we structure our schools, and it's called stereotype threat. So we know from studies that if you simply say in a test, this test is going to measure your intelligence, and say nothing else, we know that that will depress test scores for Black students. Why is that? Because the threat of the stereotype of doing poorly on a test and then reconfirming a stereotype that exists, that Black people are less intelligent, the stress of doing that will depress test scores. If you don't say that, there is no effect on test scores. It's statistically exactly what we would expect. So just by flagging for someone, hey, if you don't do well on this, you're going to confirm a stereotype about your group, it can cause so much stress and anxiety for people that it will hinder their performance. So we already know that. We studied it for years on various sociological studies. So that is a part of how people think, that is also a part of internalized oppression and how that works. One more way this works is on how we behave with each other. So there's another term I want you to know. It's called code switching. And what that term is if you are concerned about how you're going to be perceived, it's you changing your language, your behavior, your dress, in order to, again, not be seen as a stereotype because you're concerned about that. So if I am, this happens in the LGBTIQA community. So if I am a gay student and I'm really concerned about if I use certain words, if my voice sounds a certain way, if my body language is a certain way, I'm really concerned that people are going to start assuming I'm gay, and then will start treating me differently based off of that. If I'm worried about that as a student, I may change my own behavior. I may change my language to avoid invoking that sort of stereotype or that idea. So sometimes we regulate or police our own behavior in order to protect ourselves, in order to, again, stop people from thinking of us as a stereotype, but that isn't really fair. We shouldn't have to do that if we're people who are marginalized or are concerned about being seen a certain way that is based on a stereotype we can't control. Is it really fair that people feel like they have to protect themselves or prevent themselves from being seen a certain way so that they're not discriminated against? We need to think about, well, what is a community that doesn't make people feel like they have to do that? What does a community look like? What would our school environment look like where people didn't feel like they had to protect themselves? That's a part of what talking about internalized oppression is about. And I'm going to skip that other point, because we'll talk about that later. So how does this all come together? Well, I want to tell you a story about one name that's in the that's a common name you hear in the Black Lives Matter movement, which is Freddie Gray. I'm going to tell you the story of his death, and I'm going to tell you the story of his background. And I think that story really brings home this idea about what institutional oppression is and what we're trying to change. So, Freddie Gray was walking down the street one day. He saw two bicycle police officers, and he was stopped by them because they found his behavior suspicious. And he was patted down with a Terry frisk, which means they pat you down on the outside of your clothes. The police officers found what they claimed was an illegal switchblade pocket knife. The family's lawyer and then the prosecutor who prosecuted the cops said it wasn't actually an illegal knife, it was just a pretense for him to get arrested. So I want to let you know that as well. But regardless, he was arrested based on his possession of that knife. During his transport, there were 5 police officers involved in his transportation. Several of those officers, folks aren't sure who, was at least 2 or 3 of them, as according to the prosecution, decided that he was being too resistant to arrest, too defiant, too disrespectful. So they said, we're going to put him improperly seatbelted or unseatbelted into the police van. And when you're handcuffed, when your hands are behind your back, that's really dangerous to not be secured, because if you fall down, you actually can't catch yourself because your hands are behind your back. So it's really important that if you're handcuffed, that your body is being taken care of, or that somebody is making sure you're not in danger of falling, so that you don't injure yourself. So he was put improperly or unseatbelted into the police van, and they had just been trained on proper seatbelting procedure 2 days before. So they should have known what they were doing, but they didn't. They also decided to take him on a rough ride, or a bumpier and less pleasant ride to the jail facility than the one that they would have normally taken. So in addition to him not being properly seatbelted and handcuffed, then he was taken on a more bumpy and jarring ride to the jail. So during his transportation, he slammed into the back of the police van during one of the bumps that they hit. He injured his spine. His spine was 80% severed at his head by the time he got to the jail. He was in a coma by the time he got to the jail, and then he passed away 7 days later. So you can imagine the outrage of the community saying, why wasn't this person able to be successfully taken to jail, to have a fair trial, to have his day in court to say, I don't think I did anything wrong. He didn't even make it that far. He was killed before he even arrived at the jail. So the community protested, as you know, and then that's kind of, and now his name is included in the Black Lives Matter movement as one of the main people they talk about in terms of this issue. His story before that, though, also tells us something about institutional oppression and what we need to change in our society. So Freddie Gray grew up in a traditionally redlined area of Baltimore. So when I talked to you about redlining earlier, I talked to you about that so that you would understand what that kind of means. So this redlined communities are typically economically depressed, meaning that folks struggle looking for jobs, property values tend to be down, there's more dilapidated buildings, there tends to be a lot more environmental hazards in traditionally redlined communities because they haven't had the economic ability to do cleanup efforts, to renovate because they weren't able to get mortgages and loans for that, and then now businesses in other communities don't come into those communities because of those other situations as well. Redline communities also have an issue with industrial development. So industries will come in and say, I want to put my factory here because the property values are cheap. And then they have to deal with smog and other environmental hazards in those communities as well. So lead paint is another kind of common issue in traditionally redline communities because of what some of those other issues I told you about. So Freddie Gray was lead poisoned as a child. Both of his sisters were. They consumed lead paint as children, and lead paint actually, lead tastes sweet to children. So it's a hazard for young children to be around lead because they may consume it and injure themselves. So when you consume lead paint and you are lead poisoned as a child, what it actually does is it shrinks your prefrontal cortex. So it has, you have issues with impulse control, with aggressiveness. You may have issues with cognitive development and delay, not being able to process information as well, emotional regulation. So it is considered a developmental disability or a mental disability when you've been lead poisoned as a child. Freddie Gray's parents also knew that he had been, lead poisoned as a child, and sued on his behalf to get him a settlement from the city and from the landlord in order to pay for his medical bills and to help support him in his life, since having a mental disability can also mean you have poor economic prospects. It's going to be harder for you to get a job, things like that. So it was trying to give him some economic resources. So he got a settlement in the amount of $200,000, and it was an annuitized settlement, meaning he was going to get small payments of that over the course of several years, about 10 to 20 years. So you didn't get it all at once, you got it over a graduate set of time. And that's, again, so you have some reliable income coming in. Predatory lenders in Baltimore specifically were targeting people who were getting these lead paint settlements. So they sought out these people getting these settlements, and they say, hey, we want you to sell us your settlement for a one-time lump sum cash payment. And there are lots of lenders that do that same type of activity, but in an award-winning story, it was a story that won an award when a reporter followed up on this company, to do so predatorily, to target people who are getting settlements, and again, who have a cognitive or mental disability as well, and getting them to sign away their legal rights to the settlement, that is considered predatory lending. You're doing so because you're getting, you're targeting people who are less likely to understand what they're signing. And those types of settlements, when you sell your annuitized settlement for a cash payment, you're doing so for pennies on a dollar, typically. So it's usually a very bad deal for the people who are selling those. So Freddie Gray got targeted, and by then, and he sold away his settlement of $200,000 for a lump sum payment of $18,000. So by the time he got arrested, he was impoverished, he had been injured by lead paint, he had gotten his settlement taken away by predatory lenders, and then we know the rest of the story from there. So now I'm going to show you some maps that really kind of, I think, bring together what I'm talking about, how multiple systems stack on top of each other to limit communities, to limit the resources those communities have, to limit the opportunity people have. So this is that redlining map of Baltimore that I was telling you about. This is around the area where Freddie Gray grew up. So these are all the red lines that the Federal Housing Administration drew around communities where a majority of black or brown folks lived. And then areas that were considered questionable were in yellow, and then areas that are considered safe, which also were traditionally white neighborhoods, are in blue. This is the median income above poverty line in black, and then the median income below poverty line in gray, in these boxes here, and this is again Baltimore, but in case that is hard to see, I've overlaid those two maps for you. So look at how clean a lot of those lines are. So the traditionally red line communities also happen to be the ones where a lot of folks are living below the poverty line. This is lead poisoning cases in Baltimore, and that map shape should be very familiar to you. And Freddie Gray grew up around this area again. This is a picture of the young Freddie Gray in his house, and this is the very lead poison paint that he consumed as a child. This is percentage of residents who are black in 2010 in the Baltimore area. And so again, you can see at the 80 or 100% concentration, there's a lot of concentration in those same areas that I pointed out to you. And this little black box here is where Freddie Gray was arrested as well. This is the percentage of population that is 16 to 64 that is unemployed and looking for work. And again, same concentration in that area. Vacant lots, so when I talked about more dilapidated buildings, more vacant buildings, you can see how those are concentrated in traditionally redlined areas as well. So you tend to find more dilapidated, broken down buildings in traditionally redlined areas. This is arrests in 2015. Look at how concentrated those are in black and brown communities. This is officer-involved shootings in 2010 through 2015, 2013 through 2015, and still a lot of concentration in those areas. So, yes, this does apply to us in Colorado. This is our redlining map for Denver. the areas that are getting talked about in the news, issues with gentrification, issues with lack of economic opportunity, those areas are traditionally redlined areas as well. So this is 5 Points, also known as Rhino. This is Glowville, Swansea up here. That's that zip code 80126, is not the most polluted zip code in Colorado, is not the most polluted zip code in the Midwest. It is the most polluted zip code in the United States. And that's because they have so many toxic waste sites, cleanup sites, industrial development. So one of our own zip codes in our community is the most polluted zip code in the nation, and they are also a redlined area. And that's a part of why they have some of those issues. And then here are areas of West Denver as well. We have our own cases of police brutality. Alex Landau is a nationally known case in which he had a very violent interaction with the Denver Police Department. He and another person, Rochelle Bliss, started the Denver Justice Project. We have Jessica Hernandez, who was shot and killed in her interaction with Denver police. And we know that predatory lenders, that payday lenders and things like that are more concentrated in communities of color as well. So this is a study from my former office that I worked for, the Bell Policy Center, when we were trying to get a bill passed, we were trying to get a ballot measure passed that capped payday lending rates at 36%. In some states, those rates are over 500%. And that means you're essentially, for every dollar you borrow, you're having to pay back $10, $15. So we know that those are also concentrated in a lot of communities of color as well. So if we don't want our own Freddie Grays to happen here, if we want to do better than that, if we want to think about what rules can we change, how can we treat people better, how can we get people to understand what this is about, how these systems work, then we have to do that work ourselves. And we have to start thinking differently about these issues. So not only is the 4 I's a way for us to understand oppression, it's also a way for us to understand how we can combat it. So we have to do things on the individual level. Going to this training is already a great first step. You understanding bias, which we're going to talk a little bit more about in the pods, is already a great first step. We need to talk about our interpersonal interactions. How do we treat each other better? How do we not microaggress each other? How do we listen to each other and understand what our fellow students are going through? What are their experiences? We can challenge it on the institutional level. What are the rules that govern this school? What are the rules that govern Douglas County? What are the rules that govern the state? And how are we doing anti-oppression there? Do folks understand these, and are they making rules that are fair and just for people? And finally, ideological. New ways of thinking about groups of people, challenging stereotypes. The movie Black Panther and the movie Crazy Rich Asians, those movies were global phenomenons because marginalized people were so excited to see themselves represented in a different way. Finally, I get to be seen as like a superhero or as a glamorous person in another country, as opposed to just being seen as a service professional or as just a sassy friend, something like that. Being at the center of a different narrative is important to challenging ideologies as well. So, that's big. Kind of what I talked about there is like a lot. To talk about the history of oppression and to think about multiple systems. So I understand that what I'm saying is a large kind of task or a large thing to think about. But we don't have to start big. We can start small. We can start with our school here. So there's United States, there's United States policy, there's Colorado, there's stuff happening in Highlands Ranch and in Littleton, but then there's Ranchview Middle School and us. And how are we going to think about what environment we want to create for each other? How are we going to think about our own rules and our own interactions with each other? And how we can do better in terms of anti-racism, anti-sexism, all of that. So our school together. These are the questions I want you to think about between now and when we go into the pod activities. I want you to think about, how do we create an anti-oppressive school environment? And when I mean me, I mean you are a part of that. You are just as in charge of creating this environment as your administrators, as your teachers, as your principal. You have decisions to make here too. You have to think about, actually, I don't think this rule is helpful for us. And let me tell you why. Actually, actually, I've seen how my fellow students have been struggling with this, or how I've been struggling with this. Let me talk about my experiences and say why I think we should change or shift things. Students your age are doing activism all across the United States. The March for Our Lives was started by students like yourselves. The March for Climate Change and on climate justice was done by many students like yourselves. So students exactly your age are thinking about these issues and what role they want to play in in changing the dialogue and having their interests represented. What is your role as students in creating that environment? What do you need to understand about the experiences of your fellow students? What do you need to understand about the experiences of your fellow students? And what do they need to understand about your experiences? And finally, what do your teachers, administrators, and parents need to understand about you and your fellow students' experiences? Let's think about co-creating our environments, co-thinking good rules, good policies, co-thinking what an anti-oppressive environment at this school would look like. And to summarize kind of all of that, I have a quote that some of you may have heard is from Lila Watson. She's an Aboriginal activist, and this is considered a community-owned quote from Aboriginal groups that's about how they think about activism and community. And what that quote is if you have come here to help me, then you are wasting your time. But if you have come here because your liberation is bound to mine, then let us work together. So this is an ask for you. Let's work together to think about these things together, because you're affected by these issues exactly as much as I am, exactly as much as other students across the nation. Let's think about these things together, and let's start with our school environment here. What do we want to do differently, and how can we create an anti-oppressive environment here? Thank you so much for your time, and I can't wait to see you all in the pride activities. Thank you.
For all of you to stay seated, but I'm going to dismiss 8 Gray. I'm going to have 8 Gray report back to their pod area, and then we'll do Arctic and Tundra. So 8 Gray only right now, please. Report back to your pod area.